Our focus for today is going to be on finding equivalent ratios, and you can find equivalent ratios by either creating a table or dividing or multiplying to find common factors. And so the first problem that we're going to take a look at is on page 439 is your solvent share. And it says Sally used all of the paint shown below to make a certain tint of orange paint. How many pints of red paint should be mixed with 24 pints of yellow paint to make the same tint of orange? So you have a drawing of paint cans, and so I went ahead and marked it, and each one of these represents 1 pint. So our initial ratio that we have for our pint is going to be yellow is going to be 3, red is going to be 4. So my ratio is going to be 3 to 4. And so if my ratio is 3 to 4, what this problem really is asking is it's asking if I have 24 pints of yellow, how many pints of red am I going to have? And so I'm going to use this equivalent ratio to help me find it. And I'm going to model this using the drawings to figure this out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this 24 and I'm going to do 24 and I'm going to do 24 divided by 8. And so when I do 24 divided by 8, what that allows me to do within the model is it allows me to figure out how much each one of these is going to be. Or not 24 divided by 8, sorry, 24 divided by 3, because our ratio is 3 to 4. So 24 divided by 3, which as you may have guessed is 8. So I want to put 8 in each one of my models. So if I have 8 in each one of these, then in order to keep this equivalent, I need to have 8 in each one of these. So my model is going to be, if I have 8, each one of my pints is now worth 8. So I get 24. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4. So the ratio is going to be 24 to 32. So that's what my ratio is going to be. And so I can continue to use models and to divide out. That's one way that we can do it. Or I can make a table as well. Or I can look at finding common factors of both numbers and then either multiplying or dividing. Okay, so let's take a look at your look back on the bottom. It says using the same ratio of yellow paint to red paint, so this ratio of 3 to 4, how many pints of yellow paint am I going to need if I have 16 of red? So let me write the ratio down. So now I have 16 and I'm looking for what the ratio of yellow is going to be. The ratio is still 3 to 4. So this would look a little bit different. So what I could do is if I want to go ahead and do my modeling is I can, instead of doing 24 divided by 3, I would do 16 because that's the value that I know. So I would do 16 and I would divide it by 4. So 16 divided by 4 gives me 4. So each one of these is going to be worth 4. And in order to keep my ratio equivalent, each one of my yellow paints is going to be 4. So my answer would be 12 pints. So that's how I can show it visually using models. Let's take a look at how we can use a table. So on your next page, you have this problem. So it says for every 16 basketball players in Crystal County schools, there are 48 baseball players. So my ratio right now is 16 to 48. Okay. If there are 64 basketball players, how many baseball players are there? So if I have 16 basketball players, now my new ratio that I'm looking for is I'm looking for an equivalent ratio when 16 is equal to 64. What is 48 going to be equal to? And so I can use a table to set this up. So I have basketball players right here, and then I'm going to do baseball players down here. And so if I have 16 basketball players, I'm going to have 48 baseball players. If I double that, so I'm just going to double this, so I'm just going to multiply times 2. And so if I multiply this line of the table times 2, I need to do the same thing to the bottom. I'm going to end up with 96. And then if I multiply by 3, so here I'm just going to add 16, or I'm going to double it, so I'm going to end up with 48. And then 48 times 3 is going to be 144. And then if I multiply it by 4, I get 64. And when I multiply 48 by 4, I end up with 192. So you'll notice that each time I take that base number and I'm multiplying it, both parts of the ratio, the 16 and the 48, and I'm multiplying it by the same factor. So here I multiplied, in this column I multiplied by 2, in this column I multiplied by 3, and in this column I multiplied by 4. And so the ratio is going to be, if I have 64 basketball players, I'm going to have 192 baseball players. So I can show this also simply by doing multiplication. So what I would do is I could write this in fraction form, and I know that I have to multiply by a value to get to 64. And so I have to figure out 16 times what gets me to 64. The answer is going to be 4. And our rule is, if we look at this and think of this as a fraction, it's a part-to-part ratio. Whatever I do to the numerator, I have to do the denominator. So I need to do 48 times 4, and I end up with 192. So my ratio is 64 to 192. Okay. It says on the convince me, if you extend the table above, how would you find the next ratio of basketball players to baseball players? So if we extended that table, we would just need to multiply 16 times 5. And when we multiply 16 times 5, we would get 80. And then I would multiply 48 times 5. And when I multiply 48 times 5, I get 240. So my ratio would be 80 to 240. Okay, so you've now seen 3 different ways that I can find equivalent ratios. Use the method that's going to work the best for you. I think most of you are probably going to go, well, multiplication or division is going to be the easier way to go, which is great. But if you want to do it visually, go ahead and build it out visually. Okay, so let's take a look at another example on page 441. And so the example that you have is Sarah took 18 shots in a basketball game and made 12 shots. How many baskets will she likely make in her next six shots? So the ratio that she has is she did 18 shots, and of those 18 shots, she made 12. When she takes 6 shots, how many of those 6 shots is she likely to make? So if I set this up in a table and number of shots taken, so I have shots taken, and then you'll notice that in this one on our table, we're going to work backwards and then baskets made, because we're starting with finding if she took 6 more shots, where would she likely be? So if she took 18 shots, she made 12. So instead of multiplying this time, I'm going to divide. So if I divide both factors by 2, I'm going to end up with 9 and 6. And then if I divide 18 by 3, 18 by 3, I'm going to get 6. And 12 divided by 3, I'm going to get 4. So the equivalent ratio is going to be 6 to 4. The other way that I can show this is by taking 18 twelfths, or 18 to 12, and then dividing by the same factor to figure out if she takes 6 shots, how many shots is she going to make? Well, 18 divided by 3 is 6. 12 divided by 3 is going to be 4. So the ratio is going to be 6 shots. She's likely to make 4 of those shots. All right, let's take a look at your guided practice. It says, what are 2 ways that you can find an equivalent ratio for 12 to 16? And so the first way that we can find an equivalent ratio is we can divide, because they have a common factor. So I can divide by 2 or 4 to get an equivalent ratio. So if I divide by 2, I end up with 6/8. If I divide by 4, I end up with 3 to 4. The other way that I could find it is I can multiply by the same term. So it doesn't matter which term I use. I just get to multiply it by the same term. So if I multiply by 5, so let's say I'm going to multiply by 5, 12 times 5 is going to be 60, and then 16 times 5 is going to be 80. So my ratio would be 60 to 80. Okay. All right. In 2 through 4, we're going to write an equivalent ratio for each given ratio. So I have 12 to 21 for number 4. And so an equivalent ratio that I could have is I can go ahead, because both of these share a common factor, I can divide out. So I'm going to divide them out, and I'm going to divide by 3. And so my new ratio is going to be 4 to 7. On number 3, I have 1 to 3, so I can't divide out because 1 is already in lowest term. So I'm just going to choose a value to a value to multiply by. So I'm going to multiply, we'll just multiply the ratio times 6. So my new ratio is going to be 6 to 18. And then my last one on number 4, I'm going to do 6 to 8. And I can, again, 6 and 8 have a common factor of 2. So my new ratio is going to be 3 to 4 would be a ratio that I have that would be equivalent. I can also multiply. So if I multiplied by 2, I could have 2 to 16. So you're either going to divide or multiply to create equivalent ratios. If it asks for a ratio in simplest term, that means you're going to be dividing both parts of the ratio by the same factor to get it into the lowest terms you can get it into without dividing anymore. So for your practice, you are going to actually do 5 through 15 all. And then I will have another ratio practice for you if you finish that.